If you look out your window right now, assuming you are, anywhere near a town or a city, there's a very good chance you can spot a pigeon.
Oh, absolutely. They are everywhere.
Right. Maybe it's perched on a traffic light, or maybe it's fighting over a discarded piece of a bagel on the sidewalk. And you probably think of it as this dirty, opportunistic urban pest.
A rat with wings, as the tired old cliche goes.
Exactly. But what if I told you that 3,400 years ago, that exact same bird was eating our food, living in our grandest monuments, and being burned as a sacred offering to the goddess of love?
It is a profound shift in perspective. I mean, we look at them today with such disdain, and we are completely oblivious to the fact that they are arguably one of our oldest and most intimate companions.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We've custom-tailored this exploration specifically for you, the listener. If you are the kind of person who loves to look at the ordinary, mundane world and ask, well, wait, why is it actually like this? Then you are in exactly the right place.
You really are.
Because today, we are going to completely dismantle everything you think you know about the common pigeon. We are pulling from a groundbreaking, and I mean absolutely fascinating, new paper published in the journal Antiquity, Volume 100, from August 2026.
Yeah, the research is titled Uncovering the Lives of Rock Doves, Columba livia in Late Bronze Age, Hala Sultan Tekke, Cyprus. And it is just a masterclass in how modern science can rewrite historical narratives.
The mission of our deep dive today is to explore how a brilliant team of researchers, led by Anderson Carter at the University of Groningen, used ancient bones, architectural analysis, and some truly mind-bending atomic-level isotope chemistry to push the origins of pigeon domestication back by an entire millennium.
A full 1,000 years. It's wild.
Right. We are going back to 1400 BCE to fundamentally rewrite our relationship with this bird.
What's really fascinating here is the modern paradox of the pigeon. I mean, think about it. We put metal spikes on ledges to keep them away.
Oh, yeah, the anti-bird architecture.
Exactly. We pass city ordinances banning people from feeding them. We view them as this byproduct of urban decay. But what this source material reveals so powerfully is that this attitude is a remarkably recent invention.
It's totally new.
It is entirely a post-industrial revolution mindset, because for thousands of years, humans and pigeons were deeply, intimately intertwined.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the central thesis from Anderson Carter isn't just about archaeology, it's about our shared biology. He says, and I quote, "We changed the whole ecological niche of this species. Their story is also our story." I really want to linger on that for a second. We have this incredible collective historical amnesia.
We really do. We actively took these wild birds from their natural, rugged habitats. We purposefully bred them to rely on us.
We changed them.
We manipulated their biology to serve our needs, whether that was carrying critical messages across empires, or providing a reliable source of winter meat, or even generating high-yield fertilizer for our agricultural revolutions.
And we loaded them onto our ships, right? We spread them to every single continent on the globe except Antarctica.
Yes, we took them everywhere.
And then the moment we invented the telegraph to carry our messages and, synthetic ammonia to fertilize our crops, we just dropped them.
Like they were nothing.
Yeah. We abandoned them in the cities we built for them and then simply forgot our shared history. It's like our relationship with pigeons is a bad breakup where we kept the house, changed all the locks, and now we loudly complain to the neighbors whenever they have the audacity to sleep on the porch.
That is the absolute perfect way to look at it. We built the house for them, invited them in for a few millennia, and now we are annoyed that they are still hanging around.
But to really appreciate the gravity of this bad breakup, and before we can even begin to understand the shocking discoveries unearthed in the Bronze Age ruins of Cyprus, we need to understand the initial courtship.
Right, how it all started.
How does a wild rock dove a bird that has absolutely nothing to do with humanity even begin the journey to becoming a domestic companion?
Well, to answer that, we have to travel incredibly far back in time and look at what evolutionary biologists and zooarchaeologists call the commensal pathway to domestication.
Commensal meaning sharing a table, right?
Exactly. It's a type of relationship where one organism benefits and the other is largely unaffected, at least initially. The deep history of human-pigeon interaction goes way back to the Pleistocene.
Wow.
According to the source text, we have evidence of Neanderthals and anatomically modern humans exploiting pigeons as far back as 67,000 years ago.
Wait, 67,000 years? That's an incomprehensible amount of time. We are talking about the Ice Age.
We are.
How were humans interacting with them back then? I mean, I can't imagine a Neanderthal sprinting after a pigeon with a heavy wooden spear.
No, you're right. They certainly weren't hunting them by chasing them down on foot. We actually find pigeon bones deep inside caves in Gibraltar associated with ancient hominid fire pits and stone tools.
Inside the caves.
Yeah. The birds were nesting high up in the rocky crevices of the cave systems, and early humans likely climbed up and snatched them from their roosts at night, or perhaps they set rudimentary traps.
So they were basically stealing a convenient
midnight snack, exactly, that happened to live in the same cave system.
That's wild.
And if we move forward in time to pre-Neolithic Cyprus, so roughly 12,000 to 8,800 BCE, at a site called Akrotiri Aitokremnos, we see pigeon bones showing up in the archaeological record in small numbers.
But wait, I have to challenge that assumption. Just because we find some bird bones near a human campsite 12,000 years ago doesn't mean we were domesticating them. People hunt all kinds of wild animals.
Oh, you are absolutely correct to challenge that. At the point in history, it merely indicates opportunistic hunting. The birds were endemic to the island, early humans occasionally caught them, but they didn't play a significant structured role in the human diet or society.
Okay, so it was just a tardy of opportunity.
Exactly. The real shift, the moment we step onto that commensal pathway we talked about, happens because of a very specific quirk in the biology of the rock dove itself.
Okay, let's get into the biology. What makes the rock dove, which is the wild ancestor of our modern pigeon, so unique?
It really comes down to their nesting habits. Rock doves naturally nest in rocky outcrops, on sheer cliff faces, and in high, steep crevices.
Like the backdrop behind you right now, that rugged, rocky cliffside.
Exactly like this. They are biologically adapted to vast, vertical, rocky environments.
Which makes perfect evolutionary sense, you know.
Right.
If you're a bird that size, you are a prime target for ground predators like foxes, snakes, or feral cats. You want your nest as high up and inaccessible as possible, in a little rocky nook where nothing can reach your eggs.
Precisely. Now think about what happens when human beings transition from living in temporary nomadic camps or mud huts to building permanent, monumental stone structures.
Oh, I see where this is going. We started building towns and cities out of stone.
We did.
We started erecting massive walls and temples.
And in doing so, we inadvertently created an endless landscape of artificial cliffs.
Wow. We built the exact premium real estate they were biologically programmed to look for.
Yes. We built perfect rock dove habitats. So these wild birds naturally began migrating out of the wild canyons and living alongside human communities.
That makes so much sense.
Right. They nested in the crevices of our walls, and instead of having to forage for wild seeds across miles of dangerous territory, they simply hopped down to the ground and scavenged the agricultural waste we produced.
That is just brilliant.
This is the very essence of the commensal pathway. They essentially domesticated themselves by actively adapting to the human environment.
But this brings up a huge problem for the archaeologists trying to study this, doesn't it? If they just moved into our walls and ate our scraps, are they really domesticated?
That's the million-dollar question.
Because raccoons breed in the attics of suburban houses today, and they eat out of our trash cans. But we certainly aren't domesticating them. How do you prove that a Bronze Age pigeon was a pet or livestock, and not just the Bronze Age equivalent of a raccoon?
That is the central agonizing problem of zooarchaeology when it comes to this specific species. Identifying domestication in the archaeological record usually relies on osteomorphology.
Osteomorphology, so looking for physical changes in the bone structure over time.
Right. Because when humans manage an animal, we selectively breed it, and its body physically changes. You can easily tell a wild wolf skeleton from a domesticated dog skeleton.
Sure, I mean, even a Great Dane and a Chihuahua look fundamentally different at the skeletal level compared to a wolf.
Exactly. Or look at wild boar versus domestic pigs, or aurochs versus domestic cattle. Human management over generations leaves an undeniable signature on the skeleton.
But I'm guessing pigeons are different.
Very. The bone structure of wild and domestic pigeons is frustratingly almost entirely identical.
Wait, why is that? If we were managing them, keeping them for meat or messages, wouldn't we breed them to change?
They do change, but they exhibit what biologists call massive morphological plasticity. Pigeons are incredibly malleable.
Malleable how?
Well, their size and shape can change drastically based on their immediate environment, their diet, and the specific way humans are managing them at that exact moment. They show more physical variation than almost any other bird species.
Really?
Oh, yeah. In fact, Charles Darwin was famously obsessed with pigeons for this exact reason. He bred them extensively to prove that a single species could be molded into wildly different forms. I mean, everything from giant fluffy fantails to tiny, sleek racing homers.
So because they're so plastic, A domesticated pigeon skeleton from one village might look completely different from a domesticated pigeon in the next village.
Yes. And to make matters worse, because domestic pigeons fly freely, they frequently interbreed with the wild rock dove populations that still live on the cliffs outside of town.
Oh, that just muddies the genetic waters even more.
Exactly. Because of this constant genetic mixing and sheer plasticity, simple visual identification of a bone as strictly domesticated versus wild when you pull it out of the dirt is incredibly difficult.
If we can't trust the shape of the bone, what did archaeologists rely on before this new paper came out?
Because the bones alone were considered unreliable indicators, the academic community demanded structural proof. Prior to this research, unequivocal, indisputable evidence of pigeon domestication was tied almost exclusively to architecture.
What kind of architecture?
We looked for the first millennium BCE when humans started building dedicated columbaria.
Columbaria, those are the massive, multi-layered pigeon towers, right? Structures built specifically and solely to house, breed, and harvest the birds.
Correct. The presence of a columbarium is undeniable proof of intentional human management. And the earliest direct, undisputed evidence of a domesticated population tied to these structures came from Hellenistic Greece.
And when was that?
Dating to around 323 to 265 BCE.
Okay, so roughly the time of Alexander the Great. That has been our historical baseline. We knew the Greeks had them locked down by 300 BCE.
That was the accepted timeline.
But to understand how Anderson Carter and his team shattered that timeline and pushed it back a full 1,000 years, we have to travel to the specific location where the line between wild scavenger and domestic companion was crossed. We are going to a bustling ancient harbor.
Yes, we are going to the late Bronze Age city of Hala Sultan Tekke in Cyprus.
Let's physically place this city in the minds of our listeners. Hala Sultan Tekke was an incredibly wealthy harbor city on the southeastern coast of Cyprus. It thrived during what archaeologists call the late Cypriot age, from 1650 to 1150 BCE.
It's critically important to visualize the geography of the site because the landscape has changed dramatically since the Bronze Age.
How so?
Well, if you go there today, the archaeological site sits on the edge of the Larnaca Salt Lake. It's a landlocked, hypersaline body of water. But back in 1650 BCE, that Salt Lake did not exist.
Wait, it wasn't a lake?
No, it was actually an open, deep-water, semi-protected bay directly connected to the Mediterranean Sea.
So it was prime, highly desirable real estate for a maritime empire. It was a massive trade hub.
Absolutely. Think about the geopolitical map of the late Bronze Age. If you were a merchant moving valuable goods, copper, timber, spices, ceramics, between the powerhouse civilization of Egypt, the Levant to the east, and the Hittite Empire in what is now Turkey,
You almost certainly dropped your anchor at Hala Sultan Tekke.
you had to. It was a cosmopolitan crossroads that prospered immensely from large-scale Mediterranean mobility.
But that prosperity didn't last forever. Around 1200 to 1150 BCE, the city met a violent end. It was destroyed twice, actually, in rapid succession.
Yeah, this period coincides with a massive historical event known as the Bronze Age collapse, or the Crisis Years. Across the entire Eastern Mediterranean, sophisticated, interconnected civilizations suddenly fragmented, cities burned, and trade networks just evaporated.
It's still one of the greatest mysteries in history, right?
It is. The exact causes are still hotly debated. Invading sea peoples, earthquakes, prolonged drought, systemic economic failure. But the result for Hala Sultan Tekke was devastating.
And to make matters worse, as the city was burning, the geological landscape was betraying them.
Yes, the final nail in the coffin was environmental. That beautiful, open, deep-water bay began to rapidly silt up. Tectonic shifts and sediment deposition cut the bay off from the sea, transforming the vital harbor into the stagnant salt lake we see today.
So the ships literally couldn't get in anymore.
Exactly. With the destruction of the urban center and the total loss of its economic lifeline, the harbor Hala Sultan Tekke was rapidly, almost completely abandoned.
It's a tragedy for the Bronze Age Cypriots, but for modern archaeologists, a rapid, catastrophic abandonment is basically a miracle. It's like hitting the pause button on history.
It really is.
It seals everything exactly where it fell, creating an extraordinary time capsule. And inside this time capsule, zooarchaeologists, the scientists who specialize in studying animal remains from ancient sites, found an absolute treasure trove of bones. We are talking about 183 columbiform specimens.
That is a staggering number for this time period. To break that down, of those 183 bones, 159 were confidently anatomically identified as Columba livia, the rock dove.
So the common pigeon?
Exactly. They also found 2 bones from Eurasian-colored doves, and 19 fragments were simply too damaged or eroded to identify down to the specific species level. But the overwhelming, undeniable majority were common pigeons.
Now, I want to talk about which exact bones survived this 3,000-year burial, because I think people picture archaeologists brushing the dirt off a perfect, fully articulated bird skeleton, like a tiny museum display in the dirt. But that wasn't the case at all, was it?
Not even close. We have to discuss taphonomy.
Right, taphonomy.
Taphonomy is the specific science of how biological organisms decay, fragment, and fossilize over time. It is all about understanding what survives the brutal physics and chemistry of being buried in dirt for millennia.
So, how did taphonomy bias the pigeon bones at Hala Sultan Tekke?
Massively. 72% of the identifiable pigeon bones were from the wing portions, specifically the humerus, the ulna, and the radius.
Okay, the wings.
And another 27% were from the leg portions, the femur, the tibia tarsus, the tarsometatarsus.
Okay, 72% wings and 27% legs? That leaves almost nothing for the actual body of the bird.
Exactly. The main axial skeleton, the vertebrae of the spine, the fragile ribs, the broad, thin sternum where the flight muscles attach, and the incredibly delicate hollow skulls had completely degraded and vanished into the soil chemistry over the last 34 centuries.
So we're basically looking at an ancient collection of drumsticks and hot wings.
Essentially, yes. The long bones of the limbs are denser, thicker, and heavily calcified because they have to bear the mechanical stress of flight and landing. They survive the soil, the rest turns to dust.
Still, finding the 159 identifiable pigeon wing and leg bones in one single excavation site is incredibly significant, right?
It is remarkably rare. Finding this high concentration of Columba livia in the late Bronze Age is almost unheard of in the archaeological record.
Is there anything to compare it to?
To give you some regional context, comparable high concentrations from this specific era have only been seen at 2 other sites in the entire eastern Mediterranean. One is at Athienu, which is also in Cyprus, and another at Tel Katna, far to the east in Syria.
So why were there so many pigeons in this specific city? What drew them here in such massive numbers?
If we connect this back to our earlier discussion about the commensal pathway, it makes perfect sense. We talked about how human architecture created artificial cliffs. Well, Hala Sultan Tekke wasn't just a village of mud huts. It was a wealthy, highly advanced city.
Right.
The architecture featured extensive use of what we call ashlar masonry.
Ashlar masonry. Break that down for us.
Ashlar masonry is a sophisticated building technique that uses large, meticulously cut, dressed, and squared stone blocks. Instead of stacking rough, irregular field stones, you are building sheer, monumental walls.
Like proper professional stonework.
Exactly. It is highly likely that these massive, sheer-sided, multi-level stone buildings, with their deliberate architectural alcoves, windowsills, and structural crevices, inadvertently function as giant, luxurious pigeon towers.
They built an absolute paradise for rock doves without even meaning to. The birds must have looked at the city and thought, this is the greatest cliff face in the history of the world.
And we know they weren't just visiting. The researchers note a very specific detail about the excavation. These pigeon bones weren't found out in the agricultural fields surrounding the city, mixed in with the rural farming dirt.
Where were they?
They were found deep inside the urban core, right in the middle of the city walls, mixed into the debris of a highly cosmopolitan society.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The archaeologists found these pigeon bones physically resting alongside imported luxury Mycenian figurines from mainland Greece, delicate faience glass beads from Egypt, and finely painted Canaanite ceramics.
Yeah, the contrast is amazing.
The pigeons were right in the middle of the highest echelon of Bronze Age society.
They were fully integrated into the urban fabric. But the most crucial piece of physical evidence wasn't what they were buried with, but the age of the birds themselves.
Right, because the researchers didn't just find the dense wing bones of adult pigeons. They found the bones of juveniles. We're talking about hatchlings, nestlings, and fledglings. Birds so young, they literally had not yet learned to fly.
This is the turning point in the physical evidence. The bone of a juvenile bird is highly porous, spongy, and unfused. The ends of the bones haven't calcified into solid caps yet.
So they are incredibly delicate.
Yes. Finding these specific, fragile juvenile bones in the dirt proves conclusively that the pigeons weren't just flying in from the wild salt cliffs to scavenge the city streets during the day and then flying home to the wild at night.
They were born there.
They were breeding inside the human settlement. They were living, reproducing, and dying within the city walls.
Okay, I hear the evidence, but I am going to push back here. Just because they lived and bred in the city walls doesn't automatically mean humans were intentionally keeping or managing them.
Fair point.
Going back to my raccoon analogy, raccoons breed in the walls of modern cities today, but we consider them a nuisance. We definitely aren't domesticating them. How do we know the human inhabitants of Bronze Age Cyprus even cared these pigeons were there? Maybe the humans just ignored them or actively tried to shoo them away.
That is exactly the critical thinking that Anderson Carter and his team applied to this problem, because you are absolutely right. The physical presence of the bones alone, even juvenile bones found inside a wealthy house, cannot definitively prove human intention, management, or ownership.
So how do you prove intention?
To find out if humans were actively managing these birds, feeding them, protecting them, relying on them, we have to look much deeper than the shape of the bone. We have to look inside the bones themselves, down at the atomic level.
Which brings us to one of the most fascinating science fiction-sounding techniques we cover on this show, isotope interrogation.
It really is like sci-fi.
We are looking at the brilliant biochemical work done by the University of Groningen in collaboration with the Royal Netherlands Institute for Sea Research. They didn't just look at the bones. They chemically analyzed the bone collagen from 37 individual pigeons found at the Hala Sultan Tekke site.
Let's break down exactly what they did and why it works, because this is where the magic happens. Inside every bone is a structural protein matrix called bone collagen. It's the flexible scaffolding that calcium hardens around.
Okay.
Remarkably, collagen preserves incredibly well over thousands of years if the conditions are right. And locked within this ancient collagen are stable isotopes.
Now, for those of us who haven't taken a chemistry class in a while, what exactly is a stable isotope?
Think of an element like carbon or nitrogen. Every atom of carbon has a specific number of protons, but occasionally nature throws in an extra neutron. It doesn't make the atom radioactive, it remains stable, but it makes that specific atom physically heavier.
So there's a weight difference.
Exactly. So you have standard carbon-12 and the slightly heavier carbon-13. You have standard nitrogen-14 and the slightly heavier nitrogen-15.
Okay, so there are heavy and light versions of atoms floating around in nature. Why do we care about that when looking at ancient pigeon bones?
Because these stable isotopes are essentially a direct, unforgeable biochemical record of exactly what an animal ate and drank during the last years of its life.
Wow.
You quite literally are what you eat. The specific environment you live in, the water you drink, and the plants or animals you consume leave a permanent chemical signature encoded into the atoms of your own skeleton.
It's like an ancient grocery store receipt, but instead of being printed on fading paper, it's written in an ink made of nitrogen fused into your actual bones.
That is a brilliant analogy. Now, to read this atomic receipt, scientists grind up the ancient bone, extract the collagen, and put it into a mass spectrometer.
And what does that do?
This machine essentially vaporizes the sample and uses powerful magnets to physically separate the heavy atoms from the light atoms, counting them one by one. The researchers were specifically measuring the ratio of heavy carbon-13 to standard carbon and heavy nitrogen-15 to standard nitrogen.
Let's focus on the nitrogen because the paper highlights that as the really critical indicator, right?
Yeah.
What does nitrogen-15 tell us?
Nitrogen-15 is the key to understanding an animal's trophic level, meaning where it sits on the food chain. Here is how the biology works. When an animal eats protein and digests it, its body prefers to use and excrete the lighter nitrogen-14 because it takes slightly less metabolic energy to process.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so the heavier nitrogen-15 gets left behind, incorporated into the animal's growing tissues and bones.
So if an animal eats plants, it gets a baseline amount of heavy nitrogen.
Mm-hmm.
But if an animal eats the animal that ate the plants, it gets an extra concentrated dose of heavy nitrogen.
Exactly. The higher up the food chain you go, the more heavy nitrogen-15 you accumulate in your skeleton. A pure herbivore will have a low nitrogen value. A carnivore will have a much higher nitrogen value.
Okay, so let's look at the actual data from Bronze Age Cyprus. Let's establish the baseline. Where did the known wild scavenging animals sit on this isotopic food chain?
Well, the researchers analyzed dogs found at the site. These were semi-feral dogs that hung around the human settlements, eating whatever garbage and scraps they could find in the dirt.
Basically the Bronze Age stray dogs.
Right. The mass spectrometer measured their nitrogen-15 levels at around 8.0 per mil. Foxes, which are opportunistic predators and scavengers, measured slightly higher at around 8.26 per mil.
All right, so that 8.0 to 8.2 range is the signature of a Bronze Age street scavenger. What about the humans? Where were the wealthy citizens of Hala Sultan Tekke sitting?
The humans from contemporaneous Bronze Age Cypriot sites measured much higher, averaging 9.92 per mil. They are sitting at the top of the local food chain, eating a rich, omnivorous diet heavily supplemented with meat and fish.
The suspense is killing me. Where did the pigeons land on this scale? Are there isotopic receipts showing a diet of wild seeds and street garbage down at 8.0 with the dogs?
No. And this is the staggering result that changes everything. The pigeons measured a remarkably high 8.82 per mil.
Whoa! 8.82.
Yes. Their nitrogen levels are elevated significantly above typical wild scavengers. Their chemical signature doesn't match wild birds. It almost exactly overlaps with the human diet from that specific time period.
That is incredible. So structurally, what does an 8.82 actually mean they were physically eating?
It proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the pigeons were eating a human-supplemented, high-protein, omnivorous diet. They weren't flying out to the wild hills to eat natural grass seeds. They were eating rich, cultivated, agricultural grains.
And the protein.
Crucially, that high nitrogen spike indicates they were likely consuming scraps of animal protein or animal fat that humans had cooked and discarded.
Wait, pigeons eat meat?
Pigeons are highly opportunistic. If humans are dumping the fat trimmings or bone marrow from a butchered sheep into a trough, a managed pigeon population will absolutely consume it. Their diet was intimately chemically tied to the human food supply, elevating them biologically above a simple wild scavenger.
I see the backdrop behind you has shifted again, and now it looks like glowing, floating molecular structures and complex scatterplot graphs.
Yeah.
Because there's another layer to this isotopic analysis, right? It wasn't just about finding the average nitrogen level. They used an advanced statistical model to map the data.
Yes, the team utilized something called the Cyber statistical package. Cyber stands for Stable Isotope Bayesian Ellipses in R.
Okay, stable isotope Bayesian ellipses sounds incredibly intimidating. Can you translate that into plain English for us?
Absolutely. Essentially, Cyber is a way to measure an animal's ecological niche size based on how varied its diet is. It takes all the individual isotope data points for a species and draws an ellipse and oval around them on a graph. The area of that oval is called the standard ellipse area, or C.
Let me make sure I have the logic of this right. If a species has a very chaotic, varied diet, say, it eats berries one day, scavenges a dead fish the next, and eats grass the day after, its isotopic data points will be scattered wildly all over the graph.
Right.
Therefore, the Cyber software will have to draw a massive oval to capture all those points, resulting in a large SEAC number.
That is perfectly reasoned, yes.
But if a species eats the exact same thing from the exact same source every single day, its data points will be clustered incredibly tightly together, the Cyber oval will be tiny, and the SEAC number will be small.
You've got it perfectly. A large SEAC number means a wild, unpredictable, varied diet. A small SEAC number means a highly consistent, homogeneous diet.
Okay, give me some examples.
To prove this, the researchers ran the Cyber model on feral pigs from the same Bronze Age era. These pigs were rooting around in the wild forests, eating whatever tubers, grubs, or plants they could find. Their diet was chaotic. Consequently, their SEAC is a massive 3.93.
Makes total sense. A huge number for a wild, uncontrolled diet.
Now look at carefully managed domestic cattle from the same period. Humans controlled the cattle's diet strictly, foddering them in pens with specific cultivated leafy crops and legumes. Because their diet was controlled by human agriculture, the cattle's SAC is a very tight 1.80. The humans themselves, who are eating a relatively consistent agricultural diet, sit at 1.75.
Okay, here is the moment of truth. The wild pigs are at nearly 4.0. The heavily managed penned cattle are at 1.80. Where do the pigeons sit?
The pigeons had an incredibly tight SEAC of just 1.26.
1.26. So looking at this Cyber data is essentially like looking at a captive zoo animal's diet versus a stray dog's diet. The stray dog wanders the city eating out of 10 different dumpsters, so its isotopic data is a massive, scattered blob on the graph. The zoo animal sits in its enclosure and eats the exact same scientifically formulated kibble out of the exact same bucket every single day, so its data is a tight little microscopic dot, and these Bronze Age pigeons have the tightest, smallest dietary dot of all.
Exactly. A SEAC of 1.26 means the pigeons had a highly consistent, incredibly homogeneous diet. They weren't foraging wildly across the landscape. They weren't even scavenging randomly from different parts of the city. The chemistry heavily implies they were being systematically fed.
Fed on purpose?
Yes, they were heavily managed, perhaps even confined or tethered to specific food sources.
That is the smoking gun for domestication. The isotopic receipt proves they shopped strictly in the human aisle, not the wild forest aisle. They were absolutely our pets or our livestock. But wait, I recall reading in your notes that the data wasn't 100% uniform. There were a few exceptions that the researchers were very transparent about, right?
Yes, science is rarely perfectly clean, and it's important to acknowledge the nuances. Out of the 37 individual pigeons analyzed in the mass spectrometer, there were 3 outlier individuals. These 3 birds had significantly lower nitrogen levels, dropping down out of the human range and overlapping much more with wild herbivores like sheep.
What's the scientific explanation there? Does that disprove the theory? Did 3 wild pigeons just wander into town on the wrong day and happen to die next to the domesticated ones?
That is the most straightforward explanation, and it is entirely possible. Wild rock doves were certainly still flying around the island, and a few could have simply been hunted or trapped. However, Anderson Carter's team proposes another fascinating theory that speaks to the complexity of Bronze Age society.
What's the theory?
We know from other archaeological evidence that there was a nearby rural agricultural site called Tripes. This site acted as a massive granary and a supplier of managed livestock for the wealthy urban center of Hala Sultan Tekke.
So Tripes was basically the industrial farm just outside of the main city limits.
Exactly. It is very possible these 3 outlier pigeons were indeed domesticated, but they were raised out at the rural granary. Out there, their diet would have been strictly grain-based, lacking the rich, high-nitrogen protein scraps found in the bustling city streets.
Ah, I see.
After being raised in the rural granary, they were likely transported or traded into the urban center of Hala Sultan Tekke, bringing their low-nitrogen isotopic receipt with them.
That is a brilliant deduction.
Yeah.
If true, that means there wasn't just a guy with a few pet pigeons in the city. There was an entire economic trade network intentionally moving managed flocks of pigeons around the island.
It really paints a picture of a complex economy.
The chemistry is absolutely undeniable. They were managed, fed, and domesticated. But here is the crazy part that we have to talk about next. The chemistry firmly proves they were domesticated. But the physical measurements of the bones throw a massive wrench into traditional archaeological theories.
This is where the paper stops just observing the past and actively challenges decades of entrenched assumptions in the field of zooarchaeology. Let's talk about the biometry puzzle.
Biometry just meaning the physical measurement of biological structures.
Correct. The researchers meticulously measured the humeri and femora, the main wing and leg bones, using digital calipers to determine the precise physical size and mass of these Bronze Age birds.
And traditionally, archaeologists operate under a very specific logical assumption when it comes to domesticating an animal for human use, right?
The standard textbook assumption in archaeology is that domestication leads directly to a larger body size. The logic is simple. If humans are controlling the breeding of an animal, protecting it from predators, and providing a steady, artificially rich diet, the animal gets bigger.
Sure, because we selectively breed the largest individuals because we want more meat. We fatten them up.
Exactly. We see this exact phenomenon clearly in the archaeological record for cows, pigs, and chickens. So the expectation is that if these Bronze Age Cypriot pigeons were truly domesticated, as the isotopes prove they were, they should be noticeably larger than wild rock doves.
To test this assumption, the researchers didn't just measure the Bronze Age bones. They compared the Hala Sultan Tekke pigeons to several later, definitively domesticated archaeological pigeon populations from across the Middle East. Let's list these comparison sites so the listener understands the scope of this study.
They compiled biometric data from pigeons at Tel Hesbin in Jordan, dating to the Hellenistic and Mamluk eras. They looked at birds from Kahar al-Her al-Sharqi in Syria from the wealthy early Islamic era, and they examined birds from Sidon and Shifta, which are incredibly harsh desert sites in Israel from the Byzantine era.
And a modern baseline too, right?
Yes. Finally, as a modern baseline, they compared them to modern wild and domestic birds housed at the Natural History Museum in London.
Okay, so we have a massive data set spanning thousands of years and drastically different environments. What did the tape measure reveal? Were the Bronze Age domesticated pigeons massive?
The results were totally counterintuitive to the traditional archaeological assumption. The definitively domesticated pigeons from Hala Sultan Tekke were roughly the exact same size as modern wild European pigeons.
Wait, so despite eating our rich food and living in our protected walls, they didn't get bigger at all?
Not initially, no. They were significantly smaller than the massive, meaty domesticated pigeons found in the later Islamic era sites in Syria. But here's the real twist that breaks the assumption. The Hala Sultan Tekke pigeons were actually larger than the definitely domesticated Byzantine pigeons found in the deserts of Israel.
My brain is breaking a little bit trying to follow this logic. Let's focus on the Israeli desert pigeons from the Byzantine sites of Shifta and Sidon. These birds were 100% domesticated. We know this because their bones were found right alongside massive, undeniable, human-built stone dovecotes.
Right, the columbarium.
But you were telling me these domesticated birds were actually physically smaller than a wild pigeon. Why on earth would humans selectively breed an animal to be smaller?
It comes down to a fascinating intersection of evolutionary biology, harsh geography, and human economic priorities. There are two major factors driving this. First is a fundamental biological concept called Bergmann's rule.
Bergmann's rule. I've heard of it, but explain how it applies to a bird in the desert.
Broadly speaking, Bergmann's rule states that warm-blooded animals living in hot, arid climates tend to evolve a smaller body mass. It's simple physics related to surface area to volume ratios. If you are a massive animal, your internal volume is constantly generating heat, but you only have so much skin surface area to sweat or radiate that heat away into the air. In a freezing climate, that's great. It keeps you warm.
Right, like a massive polar bear.
Exactly. But in the scorching, arid heat of the Israeli desert, you want to maximize your surface area relative to your internal volume so you can shed heat as fast as possible. You want to be small. So the harsh desert environment naturally favored the survival of smaller pigeons.
Okay, so the environment naturally kept them small. But if humans were managing them in dovecotes, why didn't the humans just feed them more to counteract the environment and make them big and meaty?
This is the second crucial factor, human economic intention. The desert people of Byzantine Israel did not breed pigeons primarily to eat them. In a harsh, sandy desert environment, agriculture is incredibly difficult. The soil is terrible. You desperately need fertilizer to survive.
Oh, I see.
Now, pigeon guano happens to be one of the most potent, nutrient-rich, high-nitrogen natural fertilizers on the planet.
Ah, it's the guano economy.
Precisely. The people of Shifta and Sidon bred massive, dense flocks of pigeons strictly to harvest their guano to sustain their fragile crops. Because they were farming the birds for fertilizer, not for meat, they didn't waste precious, scarce desert water and grain trying to fatten the birds up. They just needed small, highly efficient pooping machines.
So as long as the bird produced guano, its body size didn't matter.
Exactly. Contrast that with the Syrian pigeons from Khazura al-Hahar al-Sharqi, where they lived in a wealthier environment with more water and resources, and the humans deliberately bred them to be massive for roasting at banquets.
That makes total sense.
And this wildly varying biometric data proves a massive field-altering point for zooarchaeology. Domesticity in pigeon morphology is strictly context and region-specific. You cannot just take a pair of calipers, measure a bone, and declare, this is too small to be domesticated.
Because the size of the bird doesn't reflect a uniform march toward domestication, it reflects the immense plasticity of the species bending to the incredibly adverse, localized priorities of ancient humans. Were the humans breeding for heavy meat, for lightweight fertilizer, or as nimble messaging pets? The bone size changes based on the answer to that specific economic question.
Which is why the isotope analysis was so critical here. It bypassed the physical shape of the bone entirely to find the behavioral truth written in the chemistry.
I do want to point out one caveat that the researchers were very honest about regarding these physical measurements. Of the 154 long bones they measured from Hala Sultan Tekke, they only managed to recover 3 complete for more intact leg bones.
Yes, just 3.
And those 3 specific leg bones happen to be on the very extreme small side of the spectrum. It's a great reminder of how fragmented, taphonomically damaged archaeological data can inadvertently skew the visual results if you aren't looking at the whole picture. They had to rely heavily on the humeri, the wing bones, to establish an accurate size average.
It's the constant daily struggle of archaeology. You are always trying to reconstruct the entire magnificent puzzle, but you only have a fraction of the cardboard pieces, and half of them have the picture rubbed off.
So what does this all mean? I mean, size isn't everything when it comes to domestication. The chemistry proves they were managed, even if their bones looked exactly like those of a wild bird. But this brings me to a very specific burning question. If the desert Israelites bred their pigeons to be small fertilizer machines, and the wealthy Syrians bred theirs large for meaty banquets, what exactly were the Bronze Age Cypriots doing with these birds?
It's a great question.
Their bones are normal-sized, yet they are living deep inside the wealthy, monumental city center, eating high-protein human food. Were they just keeping them around as pets to hang out in the courtyards?
To answer the ultimate question of why the Bronze Age Cypriots were keeping these semi-domesticated birds, we have to look away from the laboratory and go back out into the field. We have to look at exactly where in the city the bones were buried and the physical condition they were found in when they were pulled from the dirt. Because, as the evidence shows, this wasn't just about farming, it wasn't about fertilizer, it was about the divine.
Let's zoom in on the architectural map of the Hala Sultan Tekke excavation. We're looking at a specific, highly structured area designated as City Quarter 1 or CQ1. And within that quarter, the archaeologists focused on two deeply interconnected spaces, Room 70 and Room 83.
The concentration of evidence here is immense, and it is highly deliberate. 82% of the minimum number of individual pigeons found at the entire city site were located in just these two specific rooms.
82% in 2 rooms. That is not a random distribution. That is not pigeons just dying naturally in the streets.
No, definitely not. And we have to look closely at the architecture and the artifacts of these rooms to understand what they were used for. They contained a large central stone structure, likely a massive, heavy table or a workbench, along with a distinct side stone platform.
So not a standard living room.
Far from it. Based on the specific layout, the ashlar masonry, and the high-value artifacts found within, archaeologists have confidently identified this space not as a kitchen or a house, but as a cultic center. It was a sacred space used exclusively for ritual, ceremonial, and religious purposes.
And the condition of the pigeon bones found buried in this cultic center is incredibly revealing. 51% of the pigeon bones found here show direct, undeniable contact with fire. They were burned. Furthermore, they weren't just tossed into a trash pit. They were buried purposefully under a constructed plaster floor.
And they weren't buried alone in the ash. They were intermingled with heavily burned mammal and fish bones, surrounded by extremely high-quality tableware ceramics plates and cups meant for fine dining or display in industrial furnace, fragments of precious gold leaf, and imported Mycenaean terracotta figurines.
Okay, I have all the puzzle pieces laid out. I see the burned wings, the plaster floor, the gold, the fine ceramics, the cultic center. Connect the dots for us. What exactly happened in room 73,000 years ago?
Let's follow the logic of the evidence. First, the selective representation of the skeletal elements, mostly the meaty wings and legs, combined with the charring from the fire, all point aggressively toward human consumption. They were roasting and eating these birds. Now, it's worth noting there are no knife-cut marks on the bones.
Does the lack of cut marks mean they weren't butchered?
Not at all. As any chef will tell you, you don't need a heavy bronze knife to butcher a bird the size of a pigeon. You simply pull the joints apart with your hands, so they were definitely eating them. But the context, the presence of gold leaf, the divine figurines, the specific sacred architecture of the room tells us this wasn't just an everyday Tuesday dinner for a hungry family.
These were what archaeologists call feasting deposits.
Exactly. Ritual feasting was a deeply important, highly structured socio-political and religious event in Bronze Age Cyprus. It was the primary mechanism through which communities bonded, leaders displayed their immense wealth and power to their subjects, and most importantly, how humans communicated with and honored the divine.
So the burning was part of the ritual?
Most likely. The fact that the bones were heavily burned suggests two intertwined possibilities. Either the burning was a ritualized, respectful method of discarding the sacred waste after the feast was consumed, or the burning of the meat was the ritual offering itself. The fire transforming the physical meat into smoke, carrying the essence of the bird up to the heavens to feed the gods.
It's like finding the Thanksgiving turkey bones buried under the floorboards of a church. It's not just a meal. It's a highly specific, sacred act of community and worship. The birds weren't just calories, they were conduits to the divine.
That is a brilliant analogy. And to understand which divine entity they were communicating with, we have to remember the deep mythological ties of this specific geography. Cyprus is historically known throughout the entire ancient world as the sacred birthplace of Aphrodite, the mighty goddess of love, beauty, passion, and procreation.
And she has a very specific association with these birds.
Yes, Aphrodite had a legendary, culturally ubiquitous fondness for pigeons and doves. In almost all ancient art, from statues to frescoes, she is depicted with a pigeon resting delicately on her hand or her shoulder. Her temples were famously filled with them.
Right, the classic iconic imagery of the goddess. Now, the paper does carefully note that the classical formalized cult of Aphrodite, the massive marble temples centered in the Cypriot city of Paphos that we read about in Greek mythology, came slightly later in history during the Iron Age and classical periods.
Yes, but complex religious traditions and deep-seated mythological symbols do not just appear overnight out of thin air. They evolve over millennia.
Right, they have roots.
The researchers, including Anderson Carter, strongly suggest that these late Bronze Age rituals at Hala Sultan Tekke, these sacred fire-lit feasts involving the consumption and offering of pigeons, were the direct, ancient precursors to that exact classical worship. The connection between powerful fertility goddesses, whether she was called Astarte in the Levant or Aphrodite in Greece, and pigeons in the Eastern Mediterranean runs incredibly deep, far deeper than classical Greece.
Because they breed so quickly.
Exactly. The birds, with their prolific breeding habits and constant cooing, were likely viewed by the Bronze Age Cypriots as literal, living symbols of life, fertility, and divine favor.
And there's one more stunning detail in the excavation that supports this deep spiritual connection, bridging life and death. The archaeologists found one of the pigeon skeletons resting in Tomb 21, which was the burial site of a high-status adult male.
Yes, Tomb 21.
This profoundly links the pigeons not just to joyous feasting and the goddesses of life, but also to solemn mortuary rites, serving as a companion or an offering for the terrifying journey into the afterlife.
Bringing all these disparate threads together is what makes this paper a masterpiece of modern archaeology. The isotope mass spectrometry showing they ate our high-protein food. The taphonomy and ashlar masonry proving they bred in the walls of our grandest cities. The burned wing bones under the sacred altar. The deep, undeniable ties to the goddess of love. It fundamentally forces us to look at the birds on our windowsills with entirely new eyes.
It truly does. By synthesizing traditional, dirt-under-the-fingernails zoo archaeology with cutting-edge, atomic-level stable isotope analysis, this team of scientists has achieved something remarkable. They've successfully pushed back the direct, verifiable evidence of pigeon domestication by almost a full 1,000 years.
From the Hellenistic Greeks in 300 BCE, all the way back into the deep fog of the late Bronze Age to 1400 BCE in Cyprus.
3,400 years ago, these birds were already deeply, inextricably integrated into human society. They were eating our cultivated food, they were sleeping in our homes, and they were participating in our most sacred, intimate rituals of life, community, and death.
And this brings us back to you, the listener. Anderson Carter had a very specific humanistic goal when he published this dense scientific research. He wanted to use the past to change your modern perspective.
Which is really the best kind of science.
It is. The next time you walk down a busy city street and you see a common pigeon pecking at a piece of trash on the pavement or roosting on a concrete traffic light, do not just see an opportunistic urban pest. Do not see a dirty, brainless scavenger.
See an ancient companion, see a relentless survivor of the Bronze Age collapse. We literally built their ecological niche out of stone. We altered their evolutionary trajectory as a species, and they in turn shaped our history, our global communication networks, and our earliest religions. We owe them, at the very absolute least, our respect.
It was a true architectural and biological partnership that spanned millennia.
It was. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final, slightly haunting thought to mull over something that builds on everything we've just discussed about how architecture binds us to this animal. For thousands of years, pigeons perfectly adapted to whatever human architecture threw at them.
They're so adaptable.
Right. They move seamlessly from the rugged, natural, rocky cliffs of the wild to the meticulously carved ashlar masonry of Bronze Age Cyprus to the ornate brick, carved stone, and concrete ledges of modern cities. They faithfully followed the artificial cliffs we built for them across the globe.
They're the ultimate architectural opportunists.
Exactly. But look at where modern, cutting-edge urban design is heading today. Look at the skylines of our newest cities. We are building sheer, seamless, monolithic glass skyscrapers. Perfect, smooth, vertical mirrors with absolutely zero ledges, no alcoves, no ornate stonework, no nooks, and no crannies.
Oh, wow. I hadn't thought of that.
We are effectively erasing the artificial cliffs. In our modern obsession with sleek, seamless aesthetics, we are inadvertently tearing down the ancient habitat we built for them. So the question I leave you with is this. If our ancient rough-hewn stone architecture is what originally triggered our 3,000-year relationship with the rock devil, will modern, seamless architectural aesthetics be the thing that finally breaks the oldest human-avian bond? Are our smooth glass towers going to be the final silent eviction notice, permanently writing the pigeon out of the human story forever? Think about that the next time you see a pigeon looking desperately for a place to rest in a modern downtown. Thank you for joining us on this custom-tailored deep dive into the hidden history of the world right outside your window. We will see you next time.